Les?
Thanks again for asking me to speak, and since we may have new folks here today, I have to reiterate that my views here are my personal views and don't necessarily represent any institution or association that I'm affiliated with. I really learned a lot yesterday, and taking into consideration a number of the views from the speakers, I felt that there was actually quite a bit of consensus and consistent threads regarding return of results. The first was pretty clear to me, at least, that the participants' views and the law compel us to respond affirmatively for requests for underlying data. A big question surrounding this is the inconsistency of the multiple regulatory frameworks, which in my view is worse than no regulation at all. And that is job number one for these recommendations in my view. We did hear a number of horror story anecdotes yesterday regarding the potential misuse of primary data. And while we could debate whether those are representative or self-serving, or if indeed the apocalypse is coming, in the end it doesn't really matter. Some of those concerns are probably valid, and bad things will probably happen, but some of it is thinly disguised paternalism, and some of it is just flat wrong. I do want to strongly disagree with the assertion that all research data should be clinical grade. That is fundamentally antithetical to good scientific practice and would cripple discovery. I do think that having some reasonable barriers, I heard this yesterday, to primary data are appropriate, and those can potentially prevent the most egregiously thoughtless or casual abuses of that kind of information. Those primary data do need to be accessible, and we need to do that in a way that precludes the abuse of access to primary data as a backdoor to avoidance of appropriate and necessary regulation of clinical testing. It's not hard to imagine an entity, a commercial or otherwise, performing research testing and then giving people an easy way to fill out a web form for primary access to their data with a wink and a nudge as to that being a backdoor for clinical testing. Also, researchers could do the same thing, encourage their participants to submit a request for their primary data and just tell them, by the way, on page 23 you'll find this research result that we're not going to bother to clinically validate. So I think that we want to make those data available, but do it in a way that upholds the values that we all share. I do think we should make an explicit effort to separate primary data from clinical data conceptually, and it is fine if the participant wants it, but the research team should not be in any way obligated to endorse or validate components of those data, provide no quality assurance other than what is intrinsic to the data that are requested, and should be under no obligation to further interpret or validate that. And I think that is part of avoiding therapeutic misconception and keeping the research and clinical separate as much as we can. I heard a general consensus that if research results with valid clinical implications at an individual level are generated in the study, there needs to be a pathway for participants to get access to that, but it's a much harder question how to do it. If there is a right to access, and I'm not sure that it rises to the level of a right, but I'll just say that. If there is such a thing, that should be principle one. We should honor that. Principle two, equally potentially important, is that it needs to be done in a way that does not significantly impede research progress. It's important to note and be honest, as one speaker did yesterday, and some of the questioners did, that diverting resources from discovery to clinical testing is a net cost to research and to some extent will slow and impede it. in the near term for sure, but it is also important to recognize that it can help the research enterprise, because if it increases engagement, increases participant willingness to perform, to enroll in studies, that is a good thing for the research enterprise. So diverting some amount of resources to doing that could in the end be valuable to us. And so I think what we need to do is figure out ways to use, as some speakers said, our existing structures and mechanisms for evaluating these questions, such as IRBs, which mostly do a great job answering these kinds of questions. And when they need specific ad hoc expertise, they gather that through things like DSMBs, which one could imagine being part of this process. And as well, we should use the process of peer review, which in spite of its flaws, again, it mostly works, and use the peer review process to decide if a given result rises to that level of analytic validity, clinical validity, and clinical utility, such that some small portion of resources should be devoted to converting that research result into a clinical result and getting that result back to a participant in a way that they can understand and use that. So I think there should be a high threshold for that. We should start small and move forward with it in a way that honors these principles that, yes, people deserve their primary data, and there's ways to abuse that, so we need to be careful. And yes, there are some results that need to be returned individually. We need to do it in a way that uses existing mechanisms, doesn't impede research progress, and is practical and useful to our research participants.